Unathi Kamlana has been appointed a Commissioner of the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. He will head the FSCA for a period of 5 years. The Finance Minister Tito Mboweni made the announcement last week Thursday. Kamlana is currently employed at the Prudential Authority of the South African Reserve Bank, and he heads the department that is responsible for policy, statistics and industry support. He joins me this evening to talk about the new role and some of the work that he's going to be doing there. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Unathi. I mean, a huge job ahead of you. And I'm just wondering, what are some of your immediate plans for the FSCA when you take up that, as you take up that role?
Good evening, Rapira. So, I think we have an incredible opportunity to provide leadership to an institution that's quite important in terms of the Twin Peaks reforms that were implemented in 2018. Since then, the FSCA has not had a permanent commissioner, so quite important for us to provide a steady leadership there. And I think also strategic focus. There's a lot of issues around conduct of business and consumer protection issues in the financial sector. And one has to approach that task strategically, given your limited resources, so that you are an effective and credible regulator. So we're looking forward to doing that work. One doesn't want, of course, to make any assumptions, having not yet assumed the role officially. Quite important to be evidence-based in your approach, so that you deal with the things that there is sufficient data pointing to the need for the regulator to deal with those.
Yeah, you mentioned two very important elements in your first answer there, the conduct of corporates as well as consumer protection elements. And of course, the FSCA playing a very important role in regulating the conduct of financial services players. But there have been issues of a lack of oversight, and I'm just wondering how you plan on tackling that particular issue.
So, a lot of work has gone into developing a regulatory framework on the conduct side, because I think what a regulatory framework provides is a clear articulation of expectations by the regulator, so that financial services players know what is expected of them as a minimum. And also, in addition to that, there is a Conduct of Financial Institutions bill that is currently being consulted on, which is going to provide further clarity on the powers of the FSCA when it comes to consumer protection issues and conduct of business. I think once that work is done, one will then have a credible basis for enforcement action if there are issues of non-compliance, especially issues which are endemic in the sector or systemic in the sector that you want to be dealing with, so that you can show that the regulator is actually not toothless, because enforcement helps to show the public that you have a credible deterrent that you can bring to bear when there are issues of non-compliance. So that's in terms of sequencing the kind of approach that we'll be taking, bedding down the work on the regulatory framework, and then on that basis, as you supervise and you discover the issues that are there, taking the necessary and proportional enforcement action.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring up that issue of enforcement, because when I was preparing for this particular interview, I was wondering, in terms of are you satisfied with the fact that you just issue fines? And when you talk about those enforcement issues, what other penalties could be faced by those who engage in irregular conduct? Are we seeing prosecutions in the pipeline? What are we looking at here?
So, the Prudential Sector Regulation Act gives the FSCA powers to issue fines. They provide percentages of turnover, for example, which can be quite hefty. But quite important for me to emphasize that what you want actually is to work with the sector, not when you already have cases where financial customers have been prejudiced, but to work with them in a preemptive and proactive way, to avoid the situation of where financial customers are prejudiced. But of course, when that happens, if customers are prejudiced, the Prudential Sector Regulation Act and the work that we're doing around COFI and the conduct standards that are out there being consulted on provide a firm basis for quite substantive fines that can be levied. But really, I want to emphasize that the work around preventative measures is much more important than the enforcement, because enforcement comes after the fact, and what one of the most important pillars of Twin Peaks is to be proactive and preemptive. And that's the emphasis in the approach of the FSCA that we will be executing on and emphasizing.
Right. It would be very important then to just briefly bring up what happened in the short-term insurance sector last year with COVID, insurance companies refusing to pay out some claims to businesses that were disrupted. So just looking at measures to protect small to medium entities who were, as a body, scathing against them last year. But in terms of those preventative measures, what is it that you're going to be establishing to ensure that protection, not only of individuals, but of small to medium enterprises that are operating in very difficult times?
I think it was quite clear in that case of business interruption insurance, I think that's what you're referring to, that you had legal uncertainty. And I think what you had with the cases that were brought to court was some clarity around what the legal situation is supposed to be. And I think the work that remains for us is to incorporate those learnings in the regulatory framework so that both the customers and the sector itself is clear about what the expectations are from a legal standpoint. I think it's quite important for both parties to know what they are contracting on. And I think quite important here, you want to strike the balance between consumer protection issues, but also not creating a gap in terms of what insurers are willing to be providing from a risk protection point of view. So looking forward to be working with the sector, that of the FSCA, to close those gaps and to provide the necessary clarity from a legal standpoint in terms of that particular issue of business interruption insurance.